It has been 6 months since Apple released the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and it has been my trusty companion ever since. And while this phone may look a lot like the iPhone 13 Pro Max that came before it, there's actually a lot new here with the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And there's actually a lot of things that I have learned in these 6 months of using it, things that I really couldn't answer when I first unboxed it, like how the interactions with the dynamic island have played out over 6 months, how it feels to use an iPhone with an always-on display. It's the first one ever with an always-on display, and a new camera system that actually has way more megapixels in it that, although it may be good for some people, it may not actually be the best choice for everyone looking to purchase a phone. Not to mention, there's some real annoyances that I have with this phone after using it for such a long period that didn't make themselves apparent during my initial review that may actually be a deal breaker for anyone thinking about buying this phone today. Okay, I don't want this to be a rehash of my earlier videos where we covered a lot with the iPhone 14 Pro, but I do want to speak about my experiences of picking the bigger Pro Max model over the regular Pro. Now, 6 months on a big phone have really made me appreciate its strengths. Size does matter, folks, and I actually don't regret going big. That's a low-hanging fruit. That's a low-hanging fruit of a joke. I'm better than that. I'm embarrassed that my mind went to such an unfunny realm. I apologize to the Greg's Gadgets viewing audience. Now, personally, I do prefer small size phones. Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. But the main reason I went for a bigger iPhone 14 Pro Max this year was to get better battery life, the best battery life possible in an iPhone 14. So yes, while at the time it was awkward to hold and use, especially one-handed, I think it was the right trade-off to make. Because listen, I'm not a typical user. I spend a lot of time, probably too much time on my phone, and I use apps that drain the battery like crazy, like live streaming on Twitch, using TikTok all the day, YouTube, and I'm usually streaming something on my phones at all times, like music, podcasts, or something to distract myself from the infinite void inside of myself. Okay, so maybe I am a typical user. Of course, I also like to use it for productivity, taking notes throughout the day, using the Things app to track my daily tasks and projects, and keeping in touch with my friends and family. I spend an unhealthy amount of time on messages on this phone daily. iMessage is probably one of my most used apps at this point, which is kind of crazy how much I don't even realize how much I use it. I also got the 14 Pro as a content creation device. It's not all fun and games and all wasting time here, right? So I have been a heavy user of the 14 Pro camera, which also does drain the battery pretty quickly. So having all of this extra battery capacity in the Pro Max has made a big difference over my regular 13 Pro. In fact, in 6 months of use, my battery health is still at 100% capacity. So there is definitely enough battery here to get me through a typical day of usage, and usually with battery to spare. So this phone, so far, battery life has aged beautifully. Another thing I can assess now with this design is durability. I feel like iPhone durability has gotten so good with recent releases, and I had this test firsthand when my caseless 14 Pro Max slipped out of my hand and crashed onto a hard tile floor, and I was delighted to pick up my 14 Pro and see that the glass did not shatter on the front or the back. Now, at first I thought my phone was completely unscathed from any damage, but I did eventually realize that it did get a little scuff on the bottom of the stainless steel frame here. It totally hasn't been driving me crazy every single day that I look at it, knowing that my perfect iPhone 14 Pro Max, this pristine, beautiful device, is now forever tarnished. It doesn't bother me one bit. It doesn't make me angry. It doesn't make me upset. I have accepted that things in life are not always perfect, and some things are flawed, and you gotta embrace all of your flaws. Not that I have any, not like this 14 Pro Max, which is flawed because it's scuffed on the bottom. Okay. The phone did hold up well from such a large drop. I should be grateful the glass didn't shatter. And I should also be grateful that the display, so far, knock on wood, has no visible scratches to me. Now, daily using the 14 Pro Max, I also appreciate how fresh the design is. Now, it's not like super fresh, I know that. I mean, come on. We've had this phone body design since the iPhone 12. But what has kept the phone fresh is that dynamic island. Visually alone, it is a big change from the notch, which I have been using since the iPhone 10. And not only does it look new with that design, it's actually a changing design element, which does help to this phone feeling newer for longer. That's because since its release, there have been plenty of third-party apps now that have been updated to use the dynamic island. So anytime you find a new app that takes advantage of it, it's always a nice little refreshing part of the phone. It kind of makes me happy to see like, okay, look, there's something new up there. The most useful app by far for me has actually been the Uber app, which I do use pretty frequently. I suffer from heightened levels of anxiety, which I feel like is pretty normal nowadays. It's why you relate to me so well and why I'm the most relatable and your most favorite YouTuber. There is no irony in that statement, I know. I know you guys love me, and I love you. And because we share this anxiety connection, I know it's hard to relax when you call. Well, you don't really call an Uber. You kind of tap on the Uber and it comes to you. You summon an Uber. When you summon that Uber, if you're like me, you used to constantly check that app. Like if it was a 10-minute wait for that Uber, you would end up checking every minute just to make sure your Uber driver like didn't arrive outside like 20 minutes ago and is charging you a cancellation fee or worse, actually calling you to let you know that they've arrived. And then you have to have a conversation on the phone. You actually have to pick up the phone and start talking to someone. And that sends my anxiety spiking even more. So that's definitely a no-go. Well, thankfully, Uber has taken advantage of the dynamic island and I kind of lost all that anxiety. Like it just dawned on me, like I'm not checking the app anymore constantly because the Uber progression is always in the dynamic island. I can see how many minutes away my Uber driver is, or if I'm in another app and stuff, I can still see my driver's progression in the dynamic island. There's a lot of apps currently in the travel department that really do take advantage of the dynamic island feature, and I'm kind of looking forward to my next plane ride so I can test out other apps that really make use of the dynamic island. A notable one for that one is Flighty, and that one looks like a detailed, rich app, which really does take advantage of this new user interface element. Of course, music, podcasts, and maps are still great in the dynamic island and have been since day one. The handy shortcuts to media controls or directions are a nice little time saver, and multitasking by quickly switching between active apps in the dynamic island is like a little nice power user thing to have. But still, let's be honest here, after 6 months of use, this feature, as much as I use it and as much as I like it, I don't think it's a necessity quite yet. There's still a lot of apps that I use daily that have no interaction with the dynamic island when they could. And I think a big reason for that is because not every iPhone that Apple sells comes with a dynamic island. The regular 14 models, they still got a notch. And until those regular models come with a dynamic island, I can't believe I'm saying dynamic island so much, we can go past a few update cycles to where, you know, when every phone has the dynamic island, it will become a standard feature. And then when it becomes a standard feature, I feel like more app developers will rely on this as a feature where they can showcase more information and, again, for quick and easy access to controls. So until that change comes, I feel like, you know, it's going to be a couple years before I can really say, okay, I need an iPhone with a dynamic island. Maybe I'll never say that, but here's to hoping. There's other big changes to the 14 Pro this year, right? Like the display is still a big 6.7-inch OLED display, which is great, but it does get really bright, 2000 nits of brightness in outdoor use. This phone, like I can see my content in clarity in like direct sunlight. It's pretty good. It's also the first iPhone ever and the only iPhone with an always-on display. Now, when this phone launched 6 months ago, Apple's approach to the always-on display was our way or the highway. Meaning Apple took a very literal and direct approach to this feature where the user could still see their entire lock screen, down to the wallpaper they selected. And personally, while I know a lot of people hated this idea because it was kind of hard to get over the fact that it looked like your phone was literally always on, like no surprise, I liked it. Call me an Apple sheep or whatever, but I liked Apple's approach to this. However, I did find there was a negative because I found that with this always on display on with the wallpaper on, I found that my battery life was draining perhaps just a little faster than I would like. And that's why when iOS 16.3 came out with the option to keep the always on display on, but with the wallpaper option disabled, I turned that on. Not because I didn't like the look of it, but because I wanted the best battery life possible. And the battery drain did feel less significant to me with that newer always on display version. So now the important thing for me is that even with that blacked out wallpaper, the always on display works as intended with Apple's new features like live activities. This is another area where apps like the Uber app could place a live activity on your screen to show you the progress of your driver's route, or say in the Starbucks app, you could see the status of your order. Again, all that stuff for me is very peace of mind, and I like to just glance at the lock screen and see if there's, you know, any additional information that I need to know, and knowing that it's going to be there, Again, I really like that. Now, before we get to the camera, I just want to comment on the performance of the 14 Pro because this is the first year I really truly felt that the A16 chip didn't matter in terms of day-to-day performance. Like, it feels identical to the A15 chip. And I know it has a better CPU and a better GPU, but as someone that switched between the regular 14 and the 14 Pro, and now that I know that they both have different chips, this time it really just stands out to me how even though theoretically the performance is a lot better on the 14 Pro, like these have gotten so good at this point that you really don't notice the app loading difference or scrolling and responsiveness between something like the A15 and the A16 chip. So this is the first year, I know we've been saying it for a while, right? Like phone power doesn't matter. This is the first year where I can truly say, yeah, like it's probably doing a lot of processing for things like the camera, but in terms of like going on Twitter and YouTube and all that stuff, I'm not noticing any speed improvements on this A16 chip. Okay, let's talk about the camera, because I have taken a lot of photos and videos with the 14 Pro, and I'm sure you want to hear about it. You want to hear about my family vacation photos, right? Like, isn't it weird that back in the day you would like make fun of families for showing you slideshows of photos, and that would be considered boring. But now if you watch like your average tech review, 50% of the review is taken up by people showing you a slideshow of a bunch of boring photos. Interesting thought dynamic. We really have strayed from entertaining people, haven't we? So I'm gonna try not to bore you. I'm not gonna do like a deep dive like I did with my initial iPhone 14 Pro review, but I have to say that the main camera is mostly very good. For 90% of my photos, I utilize the regular 12 megapixel mode with pixel binning, and I'd say most of my photos come out looking really good in most situations with, you know, like excellent dynamic range, clarity, details, good highlight roll off, all that stuff. However, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I feel like the 14 Pro does occasionally pop out a pretty bad photo due to its heavy processing in this pixel binned mode. Like sometimes I'll take a photo and I'll see a preview of the photo and I think that looks great, but then the processing like kicks in like a second later and I see like a lot of over sharpening that just makes the photo look badly processed to me. It's not every photo, but I do feel like it happens a lot more on my 14 Pro than it has on any other iPhone that I've used before. Now the big surprise for me this year was the front-facing camera. It's just so good with the addition of autofocus. It can actually take some really impressive selfie photos, and using it to record front-facing videos is actually really nice as well. It produces some really great videos, and there's times where like I think people would be fooled and they would think like this was the rear-facing camera, and you know, I'm just obsessed with myself. So anytime I take a selfie and I see my beautiful face in that front-facing camera, I'm obsessed with how good looking I am. So, you know, it's just a winning feature for me. Now, let's talk about the other lens, the lens that needs to go, and that is the 3x telephoto lens. Listen, I've recently tested out and reviewed the S23 Ultra, and while that camera system has its own pros and cons, one thing that is undeniable is the zoom on the S23 Ultra kicks the butt of the 14 Pro Max. And that's because it has a native 10x zoom, and no matter what kind of zoom shot you take, if you need to punch in more beyond 3x, it is going to look better on the S23 Ultra, which is why I really hope that with the next iPhone 15 Pro, I mean, this is like the mid-cycle, right? It's time to talk about features we want. On the 15 Pro, I hope Apple goes with a 6x or a 10x zoom and gets rid of the 3x lens. I really think that this lens is super redundant at this point, especially because of that handy 2x mode that Apple introduced by cropping into that bigger 48 megapixel sensor for a full 12 megapixel photo. Like, we don't need a 2x mode and a 3x mode. Let's go beyond that because they're just so close already. Give us something better. If you're gonna have a zoom on here, Apple, let's punch it up a bit. All right, I said 90% of my shots were on the 12 megapixel camera, but occasionally I do turn on Apple's Pro RAW mode to utilize the full sensor readout of that 48 megapixel sensor. And I usually do this when I'm taking photos of something that I want to preserve in the highest quality or photos that I know I'll want to edit and tweak later. Overall, the Pro RAW mode gives you a lot of flexibility when editing your photos and just gives you way more detail to work with than the regular 12 megapixel mode. You can crop in a lot, you can blow up these pictures, and they look absolutely fantastic. And the Pro RAW mode itself is just an excellent way to take photos, get more information, but still keep the benefits of computational photography. But that does bring me to an annoyance. That's right, it's right over here. The Lightning port. Now, I've been a long defender of this guy, the Lightning port. We've had some good times, me and the Lightning port, okay? You know, I don't want to call myself a lightning port hater, but at this point, I mentioned before that I use this phone for content creation. I'm shooting a lot of video on it. Sometimes I'm utilizing the bigger file sizes of those 48 megapixel sensors. This thing as a content creation device is so good. Like the video you can get on this for a smartphone, it's just so good to me. Like there's times where I'm even questioning, like, do I need to bring like a big camera with me? Like there's a lot of inserts in these videos that I use for YouTube where it's like, I'm just gonna use my iPhone camera and I don't think anyone's really gonna notice. But the lightning port, it charges, right? It does what we need it to do. But when you have a lot of video and photo that you need to offload to a computer, let's say, and it's slow. It's slow to transfer those things. And with things like this Apple ProRAW photo mode, and especially if you utilize something like ProRes Video, it takes a very long time to get those files off this phone, even connected with that lightning cable. And AirDrop just isn't a good enough solution, because if you have a lot of photos and videos, it takes a long time for that too. So what's the obvious solution here? Apple for the 15 Pro. As much as I like the lightning port for charging my phone, it's a fine port. The first reversible port, it did a lot of good things for the iPhone. It was better than the 30 pin. It's time to give us a USB-C port, not because I want to charge it with a USB-C port, but because I need faster data rate transfer. Like if you could put a Thunderbolt port on this, even a USB-C Thunderbolt port on this, that's going to be so much better for pro users who actually use this thing for content creation now. This thing is so great for photo and video, but when you're dealing with those bigger file sizes especially, you need a faster way to take off and offload those. You need a faster way to offload these files onto a computer. So that would be my number one complaint with the 14 Pro Max. It's so capable and so powerful with its camera system now, but it's just being held back as a content creation device because it doesn't have a USB-C port. So hopefully, and rumors are saying, the 15 Pro will get that USB-C port, and hopefully it's a very, 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 very fast port, because that's all I care about. Like if they put a USB-C port on it and it's lightning speeds, and that's the only difference, I could charge USB-C, I'm gonna be so upset, because I just want faster data transfer rates. But yeah, overall, do I recommend the iPhone 14 Pro after 6 months of use? I do. I still think this year especially, this was a standout phone when you compared it against the regular 14. You got a lot of bang for your buck with the features compared to the regular 14, and things like this camera system, all that stuff are great. Now, listen, if your current phone works fine and you can wait 6 months for Apple to release the iPhone 15, you're going to get an even better deal when that happens. There's a lot of exciting rumors there, but I think this is still a fine phone to get. I would just say that if you are planning to use this for content creation and you want that faster port, maybe you should wait. I don't like telling people to wait, because it's like, well, maybe you need a new phone now. But like if your current phone's fine and you know you're going to be using that for content creation, maybe wait for the USB-C port. But all right, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, why don't you give me a like? If you want to see more from the channel, make sure you're subscribed. And as always, thank you so much for watching. 6 months later, the iPhone 14 Pro Max, probably one of my favorite iPhones ever. No surprise, right? So take care, everyone. Have a great day. And my watch has buzzed me, so I think it's time to end the video. Goodbye.